Cool, awesome. Happy Friday, everybody. This is the Ascend Data Friday. We just put this together last week. This is the second episode in the series. And again, just quick introduction. My name is Jove. I'm a solution architect at Ascend here. Before Ascend, I was at a company called Cubo doing a lot of Spark and Hadoop in the cloud, as well as a company called Autonomy, which then got acquired by HP. And I'll pass it over to my co-host, Andy here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy. I'm on the product and engineering side here at Ascend. Previously, I was doing some ML engineering, data engineering work at an ad tech company called Quantcast.
Awesome. So just to give you folks a little bit more context, if you're joining us for the first time, so the Ascend Data Friday is a webinar series by data engineers for data engineers. So there will be 4 sections in the next 30 minutes. So we're going to pick a data engineering challenge we're going to go through. Then we're going to talk about the Ascend approach. We're also going to do a live demo just to show this in action. The last part is the fire round. We are looking forward to questions from all of the participants we have on the call. So without further ado, let's get started. So first of all, before we get started with this week's challenge, data engineering challenge, we just want to talk a little bit more about Ascend Govern. It's a set of features we released on March 24th. It's the final element of our unified data engineering platform that allows data engineers to build, run, and integrate with any toolings they have in their data landscape. And it includes some common elements such as cataloging, access control, and auditing, the usual data governance features you may expect. Today, we are going to focus on data lineage. It's one of the 2 very interesting and groundbreaking components, we believe. The other one is datanomics. So we'll talk about datanomics in a different time. But today, we're going to focus on data lineage. So that gets to the part where we're going to talk about a challenge, which is data lineage for this week. So as a data engineer, 2 very, very common problems I run into is, number one, I want to change the calculation of a particular column in the data set, right? What does that impact? How many other data sets may be dependent on this data set that could get impacted? More importantly, which other groups are going to yell at me by making this change, right, essentially? And then on the other hand, for my consumers, I often get questions from my consumers such as like, hey, I see this column, let's say total amounts, right? So how do I quickly tell my consumers where this column is coming from and how it's calculated? As a data engineer, I can always answer these type of questions, but it just takes time, right? So how do I answer these questions with 100% of accuracy, but not in days and weeks, but instead in seconds and minutes? That's my challenge, right, as a data engineer. Andy, any personal experience here you could relate to?
No, yeah, totally agreed. I mean, I definitely had to, try to track lineage without any sort of tool before, and that becomes extremely painful, especially if you're trying to live debug, why did this model like completely detract or something like that, or deteriorate. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of lineage, if we take a step back, sometimes when you say data lineage, some people don't even think about it at a columnar level. And, honestly, if you think about lineage at a data set level, it becomes pretty useless, honestly, because I feel like everybody's worked with some series of tables that have, 400, 500 columns. And at that point, that's where the true pain of lineage, I think, really manifests itself.
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of us are doing this already, and some of us are using tools and some are not. It's not that we cannot do it; it just takes time. It's just like how long it takes, right?
Yeah.
So the scenario of not using any tools takes really long, but towards that end, I also want to kind of transition into the next session, which is some of the typical options we see, right? If we are to use some tooling, so the two kind of tooling we see on the market is one is really co-aware. So what that means is it will tell me how the codes and the transforms are linked to each other, which means it will tell me like all the scripts that potentially are related to generating that column that I'm concerned about. However, I mean, does every single one of these scripts actually has a calculation impacted this particular column? Then I can answer that secondary question until I examine the code in detail and every single one of these scripts that are potentially related, right? And the second category of products are more in the catalog space. So MDM, metadata management space, where it across the existing data sets I have, so to speak, like taking inventory of them, but there's no knowledge about the actual code or logic that generates that data set. So unless I'm working with some static pipeline that has a full documentation, otherwise I'm also like pretty lost here, even if I were to use the inventory products. So these are the two types of products I'm working with primarily, and from my experience. Andy, have you seen anything else, or do you have more to speak towards these two?
Yeah, I've definitely played around with some open source stuff before, but I feel like the biggest issue with them is, whether, you you have to read a bunch of code, or you have to track a bunch of different data sets or inventory, or just files in S3. It's all just super like human intensive, and I always find myself after like debugging some sort of lineage issue to just be like completely exhausted of just like reading so many different SQL queries or Python code and stuff like that.
So that's actually interesting. You think this is easier than the manual approach, or just by a little bit, by a lot, or helps a
It's
little bit?
debatable. I think like some of these tools, it still ultimately comes down to how well you organize and you use them yourself. Like I'm sure that there's ways where people have organized, a series of like code-based transforms in very efficient ways, but there's really no best practices around it. And I think that's my biggest gripe, because you can move from project A to project B and just deal with a completely different type of data infrastructure with a different lineage layer on top of that. So it's almost like you're reinventing the wheel every single time.
That's very true. Okay, awesome. So thanks a lot for that. Yeah, I cannot say it better than that actually. So let's move on to talk about the Ascend approach then. How does Ascend tackles this problem? So Ascend's data-aware system at the core, it dynamically builds and maintains the complete end-to-end lineage at a column level already as the pipelines are being built. So there's no additional buttons users would need to click, because we're Ascend is a data-aware system. So as the pipeline is being built, it's already doing this, so to speak. And the lineage actually will include any and all the calculation done against these columns, so that there's a complete lineage picture. So users would not need to analyze the code, so to speak, just to understand exactly whether which script impacted the particular column or not, right? So, anything else to add, Andy, here?
Yeah, I think the cool part about how we approached Lineage was, we realized that, a lot of our customers had these pain points. And it honestly wasn't something that, we went out to build a Lineage tool, but it was realizing that the foundation of DAGs within Ascend and the way that data pipelines work are, code declarative, in the sense that, we focus really on how you define what the end state of your data should be, and then we optimize Spark jobs to get there. So building a lineage feature on top of that was really not too much of a change to how we viewed data, right? The whole like DAG approach is inherently beneficial to a lineage feature and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these might be more obvious once we get to the demo piece. But if you guys have any questions, please feel free to send it out in either the Q&A session or over the chat window. So we'll definitely get to them during the fire round. Sorry, I gotta move around. My dog was barking. This working from home thing. I'm still trying to adapt to this.
It's only I think like day 15 of California shelter in place, so we're also trying to get used to all this craziness.
Yeah. Cool. So let's get into the demo. Let me exit out of this. You guys can still see my screen okay, right?
Yes, you're good.
Cool. So here is the one of the ascend data flow. I'm also in data analyst Judy's data flow. So imagine like going back to two challenge we mentioned at the beginning, right? If my data consumer Judy, she's one of the analysts on our data analyst team. So she's working with this data set that I make available to her. And she's working with the daily writes versus total amounts. And she saw this sum total amounts column that seems to be like taking the sum of some total amounts column, but then like she actually won't have visibility into the full picture of where this column is coming from. So that's where the data lineage comes from in a sense, right? So the data lineage is exposed through an API, and we can we created this Jupyter notebook to connect to the Lineage API basically in here. As a data engineer, I'm Jove, I'm supporting Judy, right? So she asked me the question, like, hey, where is my sum total amounts actually getting calculated? Can you show me the full journey of it, right? So what I did is I say, okay, so I put Judy's data flow in here, and then the destination component is this particular component daily writes versus total amounts. And then the destination column is sum total amounts that she asked me about, right? So I just did a run all. So all of these results should be up to date now. So now I could visualize the upstream dependency of a particular column now in this Jupyter notebook. So this is rather small, but let me make it a little bit bigger. So the daily writes versus total amounts has this column actually came through this data feed. So this data feed is actually something Judy still has access to, right? But everything across the data feed, actually Judy won't be able to see that because it's generated and maintained over here in a different data flow. So in this upstream data flow, basically I took the green cap data, union it with yellow cap data, and then join it with the weather API. So that part Judy cannot see. But in the lineage report, I actually generated all of that, right? Even though the column is calculated from two different data pipelines, so to speak. So over here, I'm just tracing all the way back. So looks like, as I mentioned before, it's doing a union, and this all cap data amount. So basically union the yellow cap and green cap. And then again, green cap is a union of this reconnector green cap incremental as well as another transform. So here's interesting. So it looks like this total amount is actually calculated from a sum of a lot of different potential values, right? So there's fair amount, there's MTA, there's total amount. So there are multiple columns actually adds up to this total amounts on the right side of the union. However, on the left side of the union, it actually seems to be just coming out from the green cap incremental directly. So then me as a data engineer, that not only I can get to this full picture in seconds, but also I may ask myself a question, hey, I'm doing a union really on these two transforms, but does that really make sense, right? One side is actually from the reconnector directly. However, on the other side, it's actually using an equation to calculate this. So now I could even ask Judy, like, hey, does this make sense to you? If not, maybe we can change this, right? So maybe instead of taking the sum of all these columns, instead, maybe we should just take the total amounts column from the green cap as is as well, instead of trying to add up all of these different columns. So now I get into the second problem, which is if I were to change this, what other things that I may potentially impact, right? So that actually gets over here, right? So it's also in the same notebook, but it's for the downstream impact analysis. So this is really to tell me as a data engineer, if I were to change this calculation, what I could potentially impact, right? So just tracing through this entire life cycle, I could then see it definitely impacts Judy's transform from here, which is this daily writes versus total amount 2. So it'll definitely impact this particular column, right? So this is how I could just in seconds tell very, very quickly what goes into generating one particular column, as well as, hey, if I want to change it, what could this impact, right? And just one thing to add to this as well, all of these are Spark pipelines. So we're not doing, this is not a database operation. So if I were to change this, actually, maybe we can just do it now. So if I come over here and I see this exact logic over here. So instead of doing this, I could say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm just going to do total amounts, right? So I'm going to make this change. And come over here. If I run the lineage report again, this is cache. I need to run all. So we see like this is already changed. So on the downstream impact analysis, so going back to what I mentioned earlier, the lineage from Ascend is 100% accurate by design. Also, it's available on demand, right? So as I change the logic, it'll be reflected right away. Even though the Spark job may still be going under the hood, but because once the logic is in, our system knows, and we'll just have that going. Cool. Anything else to add? Any questions?
I mean, I can add a little bit before we move on to Q&A. But yeah, I mean, like, I think the context with the analyst is honestly like a very, very valid one. And I think when we talk to customers a lot, you know, data engineering teams serve data sets either to data science teams, BI teams, and, you know, especially when your downstream client of your data client, you know, uses your data a lot, and like say you're building a model, I think that, you know, there's a lot of heuristics associated with model building and being able to track, you know, how did I lose precision on this column, or, you know, how did this grouping get calculated and stuff like that becomes really, really powerful, because it's just that feedback loop time that you mentioned, right? Turning days and, you know, weeks to minutes, maybe hours. Yeah. Alrighty, cool. Yeah, thanks for the demo, Jove. Are we ready to move on to Q&A?
Yeah, let's move on to our last session, which is the fire round. And
All
see,
right.
we have one question coming in.
Yeah, so we have a question from Tom asking, is this a feature I have to buy, or is it part of the core product?
So this is part of the core product. So the best part of this is we don't have special pricing for this. So as I mentioned before, by design, our data aware system, as the data engineers building the pipeline, all of these are calculated under the hood. So this is available for everybody, for every Ascend customer, as well as every trial user immediately.
Right. Awesome. Yeah. And to go off of that, this lineage feature is in that whole ascend govern piece, which is the I guess top layer of the Ascend Unified Data Engineering platform. And it seems very simple, but it's just turning all of the really fancy data magic happening under the hood into a nice to use feature. Cool. Let me see. We have one more question coming in. So the question is if I update one of my transforms or components, how quickly will it take for the lineage to become up to date too?
Oh, yeah, the answer is right away. This is actually exactly what we did just now. So we come in here, we change the total amount calculation. Instead of trying to add up all the tips, all the NTA tags, and all these other things, we essentially flip it back to like, hey, why don't I just use the total amount from the raw data set, right? So after we change this, yeah.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about just a little bit into like how that happened so quickly, because honestly, like I think like having used other data lineage tools before, it does seem very black magic-y, right?
Yeah, so yeah, and maybe Andy, like you can even speak better to this, but I think like my approach, like I think as I mentioned earlier, as these logics are changed, it's already recorded in our meta data management system, so to speak, right? And then the data lineage API is essentially pulling the information from that meta management system. So just imagine like as I make this logic change, I basically committed a record to the backend database, so to speak. And when I query the lineage, I just run a query out of that SQL database. So therefore, the result is immediately available after I make those changes. It's not a batch job of any kind, so it's just a very simple database operation.
Right, right. I think that, a little bit on top of that is, we focus a lot on, metadata management of the code that is focused on transforming your data. So Lineage can run independently of, Spark jobs, data processes, and stuff like that. So that's what makes it, very simple to track a column, from front to back. Okay, I think we have one more question. Hard to believe this just happens all behind the scenes. Is there any config or manual maintenance?
Yeah, so there's no maintenance at all because, like I said, at the core of this operation, it's a database operation, right? So as users commit changes to the logic of the pipeline, the Lineage API essentially pulls that information out. And in terms of config, because the Lineage product right now, we only expose it at the API level. So which is what that means is you'll see I'm using this Jupyter notebook, right? To basically query the Lineage API to put it in the fancy charts like this using some Python visualization library. So this notebook is something we open source. So how to consume the data from the Lineage API, I guess that's like some config, but if you are to use the notebook we open source to the community, then there's no config as well.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There is a documentation around this programmatic way to access the lineage through the SDK. And yeah, there's actually a question that perfectly aligns with that. They're asking, where do I find the notebook?
Oh, yeah, so you could go over to our Ascend GitHub page. Yeah, I'll send a link over as a follow-up. So it's in the repository over here. Oh,
SDK Python, I believe.
This one?
Yeah. So there is the examples folder, and you'll be able to find the Lineage API right in there. Yeah. Okay, cool. So I think for the sake of time, I think we're gonna have to cut off this fire round a little bit early. Try to keep this under half an hour. Yeah, so Thank you for the demo, Jove. Thank you to everybody for participating during Q&A. And yeah, just like to thank everyone for participating in our second round of the Ascend Data Friday. We're always looking to hear from you, the data engineering community, whatever questions you have about what you've seen here today, or, if there's something that, you're interested in recently, whether it be, a data project you're working on or a challenge that you've run into, we love to hear from you all. So feel free to drop us an email. Our emails are up on the screen, very straightforward. Yeah, anything else to add, Joe?
Oh, thank you very much, Andy, for co-hosting this with us, and thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, we'll be back next week to talk more about data feeds and being able to share data across organizations. And yeah, hope everybody stays safe and 6 feet apart from each other.
Awesome, and have a good weekend.